I'm Kelly M., and you're on the Common Surface. And we are blessed to have David Sielaff with us tonight. David is a biblical scholar, an expert in how to interpret scriptures, and has a fascinating topic to speak to us about tonight. His particular recent area of research concerns the Temple Mount. Where was it? Where would a new temple be built? How does where that temple, if it were to be built, be located? Would it be on the Temple Mount that we currently think of Mount Zion now, which is associated with Nestorian Christianity and also with the Dome of the Rock in Islam and the Al-Aqsa Mosque? Or is it possible that the actual Temple Mount from the time of David was located some distance away? So I'm really excited to dig into this topic because when you are thinking about these kinds of tensions between uh, various different faiths, if they're at peace, you call it ecumenicism, and if they're not at peace, you call it sectarian. And so what we're looking at is is the issue of the Temple Mount really an issue at all? All right. So with that, David's on the line with me here, and so David, why don't you say hello to everyone?
Hello, everyone. Kelly, I loved your intro because it brought back memories of another voice and another time
Yeah,
with
we were both.
Georgianne Hughes, the
Yeah,
Bite
we were.
Show.
Yeah, we were both friends with Georgianne, and she did. She asked me before she passed to take over and continue the Bite Show, and I always wanted to do it, but I wanted to kind of do it in my own
Yeah,
format. So this is, in a sense, the continuation of the Bite Show, and I'm really,
good.
I interviewed Joseph a couple weeks ago,
Yeah,
and now I'm really really happy to talk to you because all the years I listened to your many talks with Georgianne on and was particularly fascinated with the biblical peoples. I mean, you hear about the Philistines, and you hear about the Canaanites, and you hear about all these different peoples. I mean, that's just scratching the surface, and
right.
everybody mentions them, but nobody talks about who they were or where they went. And it's just like it's just really foundational knowledge. I mean, I went to 12 years of Catholic school, and I have to say they didn't really teach us anything at all about the
Well,
faith.
you had the history, right? The history was kind of interesting. That's what caught me up when I was a Protestant Lutheran, went through catechism class. Really enjoyed the Old Testament history. So,
Yeah, it's a lot of history. It's a long period of time, and there's a lot of
yeah,
things going on in that book. I mean, it reads sometimes it reads like war news, you know,
yeah.
you know, and like a newspaper, landing on the sidewalk. Um,
I studied one time with a Jewish rabbi, and we had a Bible study, and we'd go around a table, and each person would read a chapter, and the older ladies would complain. Well, it's so violent that this Old Testament history and Kings and Chronicles. That's the way it was,
uh,
and
yeah, yeah.
it's
So
not nice stuff, but neither is regular life
no,
sometimes.
as we're seeing in Europe right now.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and in a way, some of the stuff that's going on in Ukraine right now is a sectarian struggle between the schism of in the year
Yeah,
I think it was 1054, uh, the schism between East and West is
right.
taking place right in Ukraine right now. I mean, Russian Orthodox churches are being shut down. There was a schism to remove the Ukrainian church from the Russian, Orthodoxy and attach them to
Right.
Byzantia, or right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then there was another thing that happened with Byzantium had to set up a separate jurisdiction or something to that effect for the Ukrainian Orthodox. So they kind of run their own show.
And Kiev in Ukraine today was the original capital of the Russian people
Yeah.
until the Mongols came through.
Yeah, it was, that's where the Rus and also the foundation of Christianity in Europe. I think it was Saint Andrew that came up the Dnieper River to what became Kiev.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, history is, to me, it's very fascinating. I don't know that part of the world too well, but most of what I produce nowadays is well. Let me give you some background. I started out as a Lutheran, and then I joined the Worldwide Church of God and drifted in and kind of drifted out. And then I went to Fuller Theological Seminary. And before that time, I studied the work of Dr. Ernest L. Martin, much of which the work with the Bite Show with George Ann Hughes. I read Dr. Martin's articles and my own articles and my own commentaries. And we discussed them. And, of course, we laughed a lot, as you probably did, both on and off the air, but with George Ann. But she really appreciated the material that I read and that Dr. Martin and I both produced. So at Fuller Seminary, I was there for 9 years, not as a student, just for two years, but the other 7 years, and for the whole 9 years, I worked in the word processing department, and I got to ask the professors a lot of questions because they'd come in and we would work for the professors, the School of Theology and sometimes the School of World Mission. And it was after hours, and they'd come up and pick up their edits that they had dropped off for us, and it was very congenial. And I could ask them questions I couldn't ask in class, and it was a very interesting time, and a campus was just marvelous. So anyway, my basic education came through Dr. Ernest Martin's work, as well as the seminary, and as well as another group called the Concordant Publishing Concern. And their theological views dovetailed pretty much with what Dr. Martin did. And I typeset some books for Dr. Ernest Martin. The first that I worked on was Secrets of Golgotha, which dealt with Dr. Ernest Martin's understanding and revolutionary understanding as to where the crucifixion actually took place. And it actually took place, as it says in Matthew, on the Mount of Olives, directly across the valley, the Kidron Valley, from where the temple was. Now, Dr. Martin changed his views of where the temple was, but basically the scenario is still the same. The crucifixion took place right next to the altar of the red heifer, which was on the Mount of Olives, and all the Jews acknowledge that also now, not just the scholars, but the temple institutes and the Temple Mount Faithful.
Yeah. So let's back up a second. Who was Dr. Martin, and why was he called doctor? What was his background?
Well, he got his degree from the Worldwide Church of God, but he helped organize and funded by the church the first dig at what everyone thought was the Temple Mount after 1967, after the Israelis got possession of East Jerusalem.
Right, yeah.
From 1948 until 1967, Jerusalem was divided east and west.
Right.
And the Muslims held the so-called Temple Mount, and the Israelis held everything that was east of there. I don't remember.
Right. So
exactly
Dr. Martin was a doctor of theology, right?
Yeah, theology and history.
And history.
At the college in Big Sandy.
But
go ahead.
Yeah, but one of the things that interested me about both you and Dr. Martin was that you're not really coming at this with an agenda. You're just
No,
trying to ascertain the facts on the ground.
exactly. And Dr. Martin in the Air Force was trained as a meteorologist. And his first book dealt with the Star of Bethlehem and
Oh,
the
wow.
latest edition of that. And he came up, the latest edition of that is The Star That Astonished the World. He should have called it the Star of Bethlehem, and then the subtitle, The Star That Astonished the World. But he switched it, and he came up with a date, and that date is exactly described in a time stamp in Revelation 12, verses 1 and 2. And if you take that scenario, which, as it says in Revelation, the exact scenario in the astronomical setup comes out to September 11, 3 B.C. Now, is there any significance to that date regarding the connection with September 11 and the birth of Christ? I don't think so, because there's different calendars involved.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, but the other interesting thing is that would be in the astrological sign of the Virgin.
Yes. And not only that, but it occurred September 11, 3 B.C. by our calendar, happened to be the Day of Trumpets. And Trumpets is the day that the announced Messiah was traditionally expected to come. And indeed he did. Originally,
Wow.
Dr. Martin had a different date, but then a scholar by the name of Filmer, Filmer, contacted Dr. Martin and corrected it. At that time, Dr. Martin was living in Southern California and had established a long-term relationship since 1978, I think, the first edition of his Star of Bethlehem book, with Griffith Planetarium. And Griffith, I heard John Mosley, the program director of Griffith Planetarium, describe in a planetarium lecture at University of California, Northridge, and he didn't know that I was in the audience. This was after Dr. Martin had died. And Mosley talks about this guy. They get a lot of strange people that come in and have strange theories. Well, one guy came in, and it really intrigued the astronomers and John Mosley. And they ran it and they invited Ernest to be there, and they ran through the scenario. And there were all sorts of amazing conjunctions over about a 2-year period before the birth. And it totally blew their minds. Now, nobody at the planetarium accepted the Revelation chapter 12, verse 1 setup. But they did that for a whole host of reasons that I'd love to get into, but it has to do with politics and religion and protests and all that stuff.
And
anyway,
sometimes and sometimes it's hard to know when you go back, when you're like trying to figure out where the planets were and how those things align.
Yeah.
I mean, people think that that the solar system is a disk, right? And it's just sort of flat and the sun's in the middle, the Copernican model. And in reality, it's sort of like, imagine an octopus going through the water and it's twisting, and the planets would be the legs of the octopus as it goes along, right? So the planets kind of drag behind the sun, and there's all kinds of other perturbations, galactic effects, nearby star clusters like the Pleiades, and there's just all kinds of influences that are happening, and it's really hard to know. The margin of error continues to climb as the further you go back.
Well, there was one instance where Jupiter conjoined with Venus, greater than a maximum magnitude of brightness. It was by far, except for the moon, far greatest thing that anyone had ever seen. And when they put this up on the Zeiss planetarium projector, it just blew their minds.
Oh, wow.
And so they were onto something. And this is all described in Dr. Martin's book.
Yeah.
And now since that time, we have a professional reading, and it's free online on our website, askelm.com. And it's really interesting, especially when it's read. I read the book, another person read the book, but when it's professionally done, and we did the best we could, but when it's professionally done, it makes a whole difference in the world. It's really interesting, and you can read along online as you're listening to the book being read to you, or you can buy the book and listen to it, and it makes a difference.
Yeah, I'm ADHD, so I love having both things going at once because otherwise I get distracted. Yeah. But one of the things I wanted to ask, if we could move on a little bit to the temple discussion, where was the Roman palace at the time of Jesus?
Well, that's what. Have you been to Jerusalem?
Never, sadly.
Okay. Yeah. What is now the so-called Temple Mount? We maintain that that's the remains of Fortress Antonia, that was built by Herod, who was an Idumean, not Jewish,
right?
But he kept all the holy days and tried to observe everything that the Jews honored.
Yeah, unless it was inconvenient.
Exactly. and what King Herod did, he built the fortress, and according to Roman specifications of the best defensive structure that he could. And he was a world famous builder. He was building pagan temples all over the eastern part of the empire. Wow. And much honored all over there.
Like the McKim-Mead White of ancient times.
Yeah. But he used Roman cement to build the Caesarea, and this Roman cement could cure underwater. And they're still not sure exactly how that worked, but it worked.
Yeah,
and he built a breakwater and everything.
And a lot of that stuff is still there. I mean, that Roman concrete is 2,000 years old, and the sea is crashing into it all day long, all night long, for eons, and it's self-healing apparently.
Now we have that Roman fortress is still there today, and if you go to the Mount of Olives and look from the east to the west, that thing looks like a fortress. And Josephus, the Roman historian, who was there at the destruction of the temple and at the destruction of Jerusalem, he described in both his books, Antiquities of the Jews and the Wars of the Jews, that he wrote to a Roman audience, but also to a Jewish audience. And he wrote in Greek because most Romans could read that, and so could most Jews who were literate. And by the way, the literacy rate of the Jews in the first century was probably the highest in the empire for groups of people. There's some dispute, of course, but very, very, very high. And so Josephus said that the temple, that Fort Antonia overlooked the temple, and the temple itself was a fortress. So you had this huge fortress overlooking this smaller fortress. And it's what you see there now is most of it is Fortress Antonia. And what's interesting about this structure that everyone considers to be the Temple Mount, most everyone, although we're getting inroads to a lot of people being convinced that we are correct and the traditions are not correct. Jesus said that there would be no stone upon another of the temple, and that the stones of the city would be flattened to the ground level. But even they would dig up the foundations, that Josephus said, who was an eyewitness, they dug up the foundations of the temple stones, but not Antonia. Why? Well, Dr. Martin speculated that, first of all, it's a good defensive position, which was used later by the 10th Legion, 10th Roman Legion, which stayed till about 300 AD, or about that time. And the Roman Legion was stationed there, and they would increase and decrease. But Josephus said that it held a tagma of troops. And there's been great controversy of people who are against our theory, saying, well, tagma means a cohort of 150 men, but it's not. It is a legion, because Josephus talks about the 5th tagma and the 10th tagma, and a later writer, and I can't remember it, Roman writer, says specifically a tagma means legion, at least to the Romans. And that's who Josephus was writing to. So when Josephus describes the different tagmas with numbers, he's talking about legions, because there were a number of legions that participated in the destruction of Jerusalem under Titus and his father initially, who left Palestine to become Emperor Vespasian.
Mm-hmm.
So what you have is the temple was completely obliterated, but on that so-called Temple Mount, the traditional site, they estimate that the stones that are above, it's not talking about the later building stones, but the foundation stones around this platform, and by the way, these foundation stones are set back as a what do you call it? When you create a structure. Anyway, there's at least 10,000 around this structure that are beneath ground level, original ground level.
Wow.
And these stones, and they just say, well, it was just talking about the temple was destroyed. Another problem that the traditional site has is that there were cisterns underneath. And I have an article that lists 10 historical non-biblical sources that say there was an original fountain inside the temple structure. Now, there is no water fountain.
Wait, hang on a second. So let me just sort of orient things for people. So when we talk about the Temple Mount of Mount Zion, right? We're talking, if we're starting, looking north, south, east, west, right? In the center of it is the Dome of the Rock.
Right.
Right. And now, go ahead.
Go ahead. The eastern gate of that structure, it's called the Al-Aqsa Mosque platform, and by non-Jewish people, that Dome of the Rock does not align with the eastern gate.
Interesting.
And yet, the eastern gate was supposed to be lower, as it says in the Mishnah, which is a writing of the Jews that explains what the rituals were all about. It's essentially non-theological and it's descriptive. But one whole section is called the Middot, M-I-D-D-O-T-H, or just with a T at the end. And the Middot, describes the relationships of everything. The lower wall, the eastern wall, was lower so that it could be observed. The high priest at the altar of the red heifer on the Day of Atonement could view into the temple and see what the priests were doing. And there was a reason for that. I don't remember what it was.
So you're saying it had to be lower because
the eastern
otherwise
wall had to be lower, yeah. So that you could see into it. There's no indication that the eastern wall of the so-called Temple Mount is lower.
Oh, interesting.
And it's not in line with the eastern gate. which is also a
If I
problem.
just look at it, I mean, I'm looking at the satellite photo on Google Maps right now, and if I
Yeah,
just look at it, it's obvious to me that this is not, a traditional Jewish architecture. This is Roman.
yeah, yeah, and it is. And actually, Dr. Martin has in his book, "The Temples That Jerusalem Forgot,"
Yeah.
several drawings of uh, other Roman camps, both permanent and, temporary. You can go to Masada and see a Roman camp from the top because it doesn't rain there, and people have excavated that, and it's in the original shape. You can even see the smaller camps from the top of Masada that were guarding the perimeter of Masada, which
Hmm.
was conquered by the Romans, about a year or so after, year and a half after Jerusalem was destroyed. The Zealots took, and one book on the Roman army said that the only reason the Romans went to destroy Masada was to show that they would move heaven and earth to destroy any opposition, and that's what they did. When they got up there, of course, all the Jews had committed suicide. But
Yeah.
you can
Now,
see right
yeah.
down in there.
Yeah. So, but if you go, to get to the, to sort of discuss the thesis in a way that, you can go into fantastic levels of detail on this.
Yeah,
But if we just want to sort of take a, bird's eye view, right? If you go southeast from the current Mount Zion definition,
right.
with that amazing mosque and the Dome of the Rock and the Temple Mount, it looks like the Romans built it yesterday, right? You
Uh,
go southeast from that, there's a lot of ancient Jewish shrines, but there's more of
yeah.
them concentrated in the southeast than there is in the Temple Mount area.
Well, right across the Kidron Valley, there are Jewish tombs of some kings, but they're not. They really don't know which king was in which tomb, but they are cut into the rock, and they're still there today. And
Yeah.
as a matter of fact, about 15 years ago, one archaeologist was kind of there in the afternoon, and he saw shadows on writings, and nobody had noticed this before.
Oh, wow.
And so he went up there, and they were able to pinpoint this a little more. Anyway, yeah, the true temple site was somewhat south, more south than east at all.
So where the city of
Mostly just directly south.
where the city of David was, right? Where the
Well, yeah, the temple where the temple was actually located was above and on top of where the Gihon fountain, the Gihon Springs, which is a karst spring. It's very similar to Old Faithful without the heat. A karst spring is a siphon spring in that when the pressure builds up above from far away, they think the main pressure, and all this water comes from Mount Hermon and Mount Tabor in the north. It flows down underground. Some of it goes to the Jordan River, of course, but there's a part of it that hooks off underneath Mount Scopus, which is northeast of the so-called Temple Mount, just across the valley, and then is somehow goes underneath and is literally pumped up 40 stories up to the top of where Dr. Martin believed the temple was, and that was the source of the fountain in the temple that Tacitus talks about,
and
Aristas talks about. Go
yeah,
ahead.
what was the name of that spring?
Gihon is mentioned in
Gihon.
it's Gihon. Yeah, one of the four springs of mentioned in Genesis. I don't understand the connection, but of course this gave reason for the Jewish theologians in the Talmuds, and the Talmuds are commentaries on the Mishnah that I mentioned earlier.
Mm.
So, and then there's commentaries on those commentaries. And they say that this is the reason that Jerusalem is the center of the world. And to a certain extent it is, because we believe Christ was born in Bethlehem, south of there. He was blessed in, when he was circumcised and at the temple, and he'll return to the Mount of Olives in Zechariah, in the book of Zechariah toward the end, and he will put his feet on the Mount of Olives and take possession of Jerusalem and the temple, and it's likely there will be a temple when he returns. And it might be at the same place. The problem was, and is that for every tabernacle location, because the tabernacle was a moving temple structure, and all the symbolism in the temples and the tabernacle, and they were all the same symbolism. One chamber, and the Holy of Holies, then the outer chamber, a holy place, which was immediately to the east, and then east of that was an altar, the major sacrificial altar, where in Eden Cain killed Abel, and then beyond that, Cain was kicked out east of Eden. So the whole temple structure represents Eden, the whole enclosure of the temple.
Mm.
Cain was put out east of Eden, and mankind's been trying to get back into God's good graces ever since.
Well,
And
some
now
of us are.
Yeah. and Christ is the way, and he takes us right into God's presence, as we will become all children of God. So
Yeah, I
because
noticed
of this,
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
go ahead. Yeah, all of these. Go ahead.
So go ahead. All of these.
Okay, all of these put together: the fountain, Jewish prophecies that there would be no stone upon another, and that was fulfilled because there is no stone upon another. Now there are first temple stones that are upon another, but we're talking about the temple of Herod that Herod constructed, which was actually a reconstruction of earlier temples during the time of Simon the Hasmonean, during the Hasmonean period, which was an enlargement of a prior temple when the Jews came back from Babylon. And that temple, the temple before that, was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And then David built or collected the stones that Solomon, his son, David's son, built that temple. It lasted until the Babylonians destroyed it. And then it was rebuilt when the Jews returned. And that temple was taken over by the Greeks for a period of time. The Hasmoneans got back Jerusalem, won it back, and then they totally leveled under Simon the Hasmonean, a Maccabee king. And by the way, those Maccabee kings were from Judah. And yet Simon was the high priest. Well, how did that work? You have to be a Levite, right, to be a high priest.
Right.
Well, Maccabees, Judah, Simon the Hasmonean was also the king of Jerusalem. Who else was the king of Jerusalem? King David.
Right.
And Solomon and all the others. Here's the interesting part. David, there is a verse, and it's in Chronicles, and I've written about this. I think my commentary is titled something like, David's sons were priests. Well, how can that be? Because before David set up the temple, he brought the tabernacle to the Gihon Springs. And that's the place where Solomon was anointed. And the temple wasn't built yet. How could David, and it says David sacrificed to the Lord. and he sat in God's presence, probably where the tabernacle was set up, at the base and near the entrance of the Gihon Springs. How is that possible?
It would make sense for a less developed Jerusalem to have everybody focused around the spring.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's the only source of water in a 5-mile radius.
Right.
And you can find people that say that. Well, let's get back to David. David was the king of Jerusalem. He held the status of a Melchizedek priest.
Mm.
And so did his sons. And so did the Maccabees. And all the descendants of David through the last king of Judah. This is why they thought they could get away with stuff like this.
Right. So how many? I know there was like 40 generations from David to Jesus, right?
Something like that.
And then 40 generations from David to Adam, right? I mean, I don't know exactly. Maybe it was more.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, it goes a long time, right? And
everything goes back to Abraham, though, and then the Israelites, and because the 12 tribes are descended from Abraham directly. So are the Arabs, by the way, descended from Abraham.
Yeah.
Many of them.
We're all kind of like, yeah.
And some people tend to forget that the blessings of Abraham primarily go to Israel, but a lot of those also apply to the other sons of Abraham.
Yeah.
And Isaac and Jacob.
Yeah, parents would do very well not to treat their children differently, because it can cause all kinds of problems, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. So
children are individuals, and
right. So we have the back to the Temple Mount. So we have this thing sort of masquerading as the Temple Mount, or assumed, I guess is the best way to put it, assumed to be the Temple Mount. There's I do not know exactly what is the Dome of the Rock, and why are people why do people venerate it, and what is its significance?
Well, the Dome of the Rock is not a mosque. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was built first, is actually a mosque, and then they built a second mosque above or in the stables, what's called the Stables of Solomon, directly east of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But the Dome of the Rock is a shrine, and this is, according to Islamic tradition, where Muhammad had a night vision, and he ascended into heaven for a period of time on a white horse that flew up to heaven and then brought him back. Or at least he had a vision of heaven there. And but this is not in the Quran. This is later tradition.
Interesting.
So, but the Jews, or the Arabs, the Muslims, honor this as being the third most important location, holy place in Islam.
Mm-hmm.
But if the Jews would not desire that piece of land, I actually, 15, 20 years ago, 18 years ago, I went to a conference in San Bernardino, and they had some Islamic people there and Jewish people discussing, and the public, the public spokesman of the Saudi embassy was there, and I took him aside and asked him, told him our theory, and he was mildly interested. He never followed up on it, but he said that if what we are saying is true, and the Jews would give up any desire to possess that piece of land, the Saudis would help the Jews rebuild the temple. In other words, they would help fund it in honor of Abraham.
Wow. And that's exactly why I wanted to talk to you tonight, because
Yeah,
in my view, I looking at the information that Dr. Martin developed and that you worked with him on, and
yeah,
and looking at the actual geography. I mean, pulling up Google Maps, go to the old city, you drill in on it, and then look to the southeast, and it just makes sense. And you
yeah,
look at the foundation of the so-called temple, on the so-called Temple Mount. I mean, I'm really
right,
buying into this, right? And and look at the construction of that. That is not ancient Jewish architecture, okay? And so we take that it's just if you look at it with the correct eyes, it's obvious, right?
right,
So you go to the southeast and you look at, the hill where the Gihon Spring is. That's Gihon, Gihon Spring. And then
right.
the city of David is there. There's like you said, there's all kinds of old tombs there.
Yeah,
It looks really ancient, right?
yeah.
That
Oh, it
whole
is.
area, you just look at it, you go like, wow, this, whatever happened has been happening there for a long time, right? And so
Right.
if that was the place where the temple was rebuilt, then the issue of the sectarian strife uh, between the descendants of Abraham goes away.
Right. And there's another problem for those who think that's the traditional site. Everybody argues against exactly where the temple was and where Antonia was on that structure. Some say the Antonia was outside of that structure. Some say it was inside the structure. Some have the Holy of Holies by what's called the Dome of the Spirits on the
Mm,
Al-Aqsa Mosque platform or the so-called
right.
Temple Mount. Some think it was to the south. Some think there's a woman in Oregon here who believes that it was actually half in and half out of that southern wall of the temple.
Mm,
And
yeah.
she's gotten a lot of interest in her situation. You might want to, interview her. Uh, she's local here to Oregon. She's just southeast of where you are.
Yeah. So
And but
so
I,
so
I
where so what is her exact position? What is she positioning?
she's just um, half of the temple is if you take the southern wall of the current structure of the Al-Aqsa Mosque platform,
Yeah.
the so-called Temple Mount, half of it you take about 300 feet inside and 300 feet outside. That's how it was a square of 600 feet. That's where she thinks it is. But then there's porticos outside of that. The porticos to the south, platforms and, where the sacrifices were cut up and all this stuff. There were several things going on. There are a lot of things going on
Yeah,
in
and if
there.
you're
Money
doing
changers.
sacrifices, if you're
Yeah,
doing sacrifices, you definitely want to be near a water supply.
exactly. To wash
You
away
know?
the blood. Otherwise, you kill off
Right.
your population.
Right.
And Aristas, well, I have an acronym for evidence that supports our theory, and I call it JAWS, JAWS or JAWZ. First is Jesus evidence that he talked about it and he said, nothing will be left of this temple, not a rock upon each other. The second is Antonia, the location of Antonia, and the description of Antonia according to Josephus. And the third is the water. Now, there was a visitor to the pre-Herodian temple in
Yeah.
about 180 BC, Aristas,
Right.
and he said there were cisterns all around the Temple Mount area outside of the Temple Mount area. Well, that's what exactly you have under the Antonia is a whole bunch of cisterns. And he said that was not living water. That was water that was collected, that during rainstorms, and it would be used to flush the system because that like you said, exactly correct. The blood used to go directly and be flushed out by the water from these cisterns. Now,
Wow.
the cisterns on the western side of the temple, across the Tyropian Valley, and then the eastern valley is the Kidron Valley. Those cisterns on the west are gone, but the cisterns on Antonia are huge, just amazingly huge.
Wow.
And that's also useful when you have a fortress to
Yeah.
have cisterns for
Full of
water
water.
in case of a siege.
Right.
Exactly.
Now, why would anyone want to build their spiritual monuments, assuming it is Roman?
Yeah.
You know, Antonia. Why would
Right.
anyone want to build their religious temples on top of that? As
Well, they
having
wouldn't,
that as a
because
foundation.
actually the rock of the Dome of the Rock is lower than the ground level, than the other rocks around it. So
Interesting.
that's not a high place. It's kind of down underneath. And in 1983, we were able to walk underneath west in tunnels and go west and see some of those cisterns. And, there's a whole substructure underneath there. Now, this is in Secrets of Golgotha and in the Temple Mount book. Dr. Martin demonstrates that this is a valid historical site where the Dome of the Rock was. He maintains that evidence indicates that this is where Jesus was judged by Pilate, right in the center of this Roman, by that time the Romans had appropriated that structure, for their own use and protection because they didn't trust King Herod's children to keep peace. And,
that makes that's why Herod spread them out all over the place.
Yeah, he suppressed them and kept them down.
Yeah.
But Josephus says the Jews were rioting all the time. So they had a constant presence, especially at the feast days. The city of Jerusalem increased anywhere from 5 to 10 times. It was like a convention city during the feast days.
Right.
And where we say the temple was, people could go into the valley, and it was like a large theater in a moon-shaped, and the temple was right in the middle of that moon shape. And you could have wonderful acoustics.
Yeah, and if you look at that area, because I just looked at it a little while ago, and it is amphitheater-like.
Yep. And people could sit
and hear
like they do in the Hollywood Bowl across the valley at the Kidron Valley, right by the altar of the red heifer, and all the way up and down that western slope of the Mount of Olives.
Yeah.
And there were probably all sorts of people would camp out. They could hear the orators coming and teaching, their reading of the scriptures, and this is what you see described several times in the Old Testament. Solomon, when he dedicated the temple, he spoke to thousands of people that were there, and they were all in the valley, and they, killed hundreds, if not thousands, of bullocks, and they had a week-long feast.
Wow.
And like you said, that blood has to be removed.
Right. And you wouldn't want to do it with your potable water because it's too valuable.
Exactly. Because that water had to be special. They had to have mikvahs for anyone who went into the temple had to dip in water and become purified. First of all, they would walk across the bridge of the Kidron Valley. They would go
and
by.
Where was that? Where was that?
In the first century, they would go by the altar of the red heifer, and from previous red heifers there was ash, similar to Ash Wednesday that the Catholics do.
Yeah.
And they would put it on their forehead. And that would allow them to go to the mikvahs and take a purification dip. They would go in one side of the mikveh, dip their head, and then come out. And it was like they were now cleansed. And then they could go into the temple. The women had to stay in the area of the women, but the men and the young boys who were using this for them it was a teaching moment as to why we have to do the sins, and sins have to be paid for, and all this stuff, or covered up. And the whole thing had a purpose, and every detail had a purpose of the Mosaic laws. And, it was a nice, functioning situation. This is why, and people walked everywhere in those days. Now, Bethlehem is 8 miles south of Jerusalem, and there was a feast day, the Day of Atonement and the Day of Trumpets was coming up when Jesus was actually born, and that's why they had to go to Bethlehem, and there was no room in the inn, because all the tourists, they weren't tourists, but they were pilgrims, were there that far out in their accommodation. Then they would walk 8 miles to the festivities that were going on in Jerusalem.
Right.
So
kind
there
of like
was a lot going on.
Kind of like Kissimmee, Florida to Disney World.
Yeah, or Branson, Missouri.
Yeah.
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 Or Vegas, So, yeah, there was a lot going on. And now the last one in Jaws is either with Jaws with a Z for Zion, and sometimes in the King James it's spelled with an S. I think 2 times it's spelled with an S. So that helps me remember. And the temple was in the city of Zion, was in the city of David, which is Zion. You see this 2 or 3 times. And one of the popular books written about this theory by Bob Cornuke, he really pounds on that, more so than Dr. Martin did in his book, and he's absolutely correct to do so. And he's brought a lot of attention to Dr. Martin and this theory, but he's taken a lot of flack for it too.
Do you think that there's I don't usually ask people I'm interviewing to get into the heads of other people because it's really unfair, right? Who knows what's really in other people's minds and hearts, right? But, it just seems strange to me that this isn't more known.
Oh, it is well known. It's becoming well known.
Oh,
there have been independent people who have produced their videos. We have a video online that we're selling. Ken Klein, he lived in Eugene, and he approached me one day and said, I need to make a video of this. This makes so much sense, and he did, and it's terrific. Other people have made other good ones, and they've done millions of views on the internet. So it is getting out there, and it's putting a lot of pressure on groups like the Temple Mount Faithful and the Temple Institute. I don't know if they're losing members. I don't know, but they've come out very strongly with their own videos specifically speaking against Dr. Martin's theory and my evidence and other people's evidence. And there's been other worldwide scholars. See, Dr. Martin, let's go back a little bit. Dr. Martin, before he ever dreamed of this situation, as I began, when the Jews conquered Jerusalem in 1967, Dr. Martin was introduced to Benjamin Mazar. Benjamin Mazar was one of the founders of Hebrew University and a world-renowned archaeologist. And he put to Dr. Martin that they wanted to do a dig at the outside of the so-called Temple Mount on the southwest corner. And Dr. Martin approached his organization that he was part of, and they got the money and funded it. And some of the money was actually supplied by Protestant Palestinians. And so they got the money and did the dig in 1969. It began, and Dr. Martin supervised the students from his college, Ambassador College, and I've talked with some of them. And Dr. Martin's son was climbing around the rocks at that time, along with Ori Mazar, who became an archaeologist in her own right, the granddaughter of Benjamin Mazar. She died in the last several years, a few years. And I met the guy who discovered the stone called the Trumpet Stone, where it says supposedly the place of the trumpeting. Well, Dr. Martin explained that in his book and said every fortress has a place where the trumpeting was, and every army did that right up to World War II, when they played records for reveille and time to sleep and taps and lights out and that sort of thing. Every military base has a place of the trumpeting. But here's something else. Josephus also mentions a place of the trumpeting that was used to call people to prepare for the Sabbath. Well, this stone was found just outside the southwest corner of the Al-Aqsa Mosque platform, the so-called Temple Mount. So they say, well, this proves beyond a shadow of the doubt that the temple was there.
No.
But the letters in the inscription are La-Beit, the house. Supposedly, that's how it's translated most of the time. But now, you see it in the museums. It says, to the house of the trumpeting. In other words, where that stone was placed was not where the trumpeting was done. And they've been pawning this off for so many years that Lamed Beit, means to the house, and then of the trumpeting. It's not the place of the trumpeting. Now, you'll see some translations in the Old Testament of the place, meaning to, because it doesn't translate well in English. But the common statement in the Hebrew is to the place. Now, Dr. Josephus talks about two palisades and colonnades supported by columns that went from Fortress Antonia to the Temple Mount, and he gives the measurement. They were 400 cubits, which is 600 feet. He gives the precise directions. So you can figure that from the southern wall of the Antonia, plus some differences, which I can't get into here. But it's exactly 600 feet, and then the temple itself was 600 feet square. Then you have the structure down below those colonnades, the bridges, in other words. We'd call them bridges, one for going one direction and the other coming the other direction, because the Jews were rioting all the time. King Herod built this so that they could then quickly get troops from the fortress and go around and throw spears and arrows and shoot arrows down into the rioters. And that's what Pontius Pilate did at least once, and I think more than once. And Josephus talks about the things that Pontius Pilate did, and how he provoked the Jews to riot, and he knew what he was doing. So there's all sorts of interesting background material here, and we have one of our supporters was died when he was in his 90s. He supported Dr. Martin's theory. George Wesley Buchanan, it's in 3 of his reprint books on the book of Hebrews and book of Matthew and the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel. And he strongly gives his own form of evidence on Dr. Martin's shoulders as to why, the temple is at the Gihon Springs. And he was a well-known commentator and scholar.
Have you heard anything about anything with respect to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that it has, some Christian, information in the center of it, symbols, text?
Well, there were. Well, let me.
I'm sorry to give you a 90-degree turn, but I want to get to it.
No, that's okay.
Yeah.
The Dome of the Rock is an octagonal 8-sided structure. A lot of Byzantine churches had their basic nave, the basic structure, as an octagonal structure, and then it was built off of that.
Right.
So that basic structure on top of the rock, long after the New Testament times, there was a Christian church there. The Al-Aqsa Mosque was, according to Dr. Martin, and there's dispute about this too by other scholars who don't buy this, there was a huge church called the Nia Church, or the New Church, was built by Justinian, and it was the largest church in the world, even larger than Santa Sofia in Istanbul, which is the largest existing dome in the world, as well as was the largest church structure until this Nia Church was destroyed by the Persians in the 500s. And so it was originally it was a hostel, it was a hospital, as well as a church, and it was huge. The traditional site is across the city, western part of the city. So, there's some controversy about that, but that's minor compared to the location. So, there's a long Christian tradition, and the Knights Templars literally kept their horses in Solomon's stables, which is a series of colonnades with arches in an underground structure. And they used to, I think where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is located today, was actually the barracks of the Knights Templars during Crusader times.
Wow.
After the Crusaders took the city back from the Muslims.
Yeah, people have been arguing over that real estate for a really long time.
Oh, yeah.
It's
it keeps them busy.
Yeah, and that if you look around on the picture, you see all these Christian sites, you see all these Jewish sites, you see all these Islamic sites. Yeah. Now, wonder there's so many problems. Yeah.
Well, one problem during the Crusades, there were a lot of pilgrims who would come to the area, and they would want to be shown this site and that site and that site and this site, but they were in the possession of the Muslims, or vice versa. The Muslims would come and want to see, where Abraham was buried, and the Crusaders. So they made up a second place for each of these things on both sides. So this is where the traditions come into play here. This is why a lot of this stuff was lost. Now, the Jews maintain that they would never forget where the site of their temple was, but they were, for hundreds of years, they were not allowed back in until the time of Constantine. And Constantine actually gave permission for the Jews to rebuild the temple, and they started laying the foundation stones at where we believe it was, not at the Al-Aqsa.
Right, that was Dr. Martin's clue, right? Was the fact that, when the Jews were finally allowed back into Jerusalem and they wanted to build a temple, right? They didn't go to the Temple Mount. They didn't go to what people call the Temple Mount now, Apollonia, or Antonia, it's called.
They went to the Gihon.
Yeah, they went south of the current Temple Mount to another hill, which is really quite a hill. I mean, it's a serious hill, and there's that spring, adjacent to it.
Right, and it's the only spring, as we said. So everybody went there for their water.
Right.
Although everybody collected water also.
Yeah.
And this whole structure. I lost my train of thought.
Yeah.
Here.
So just to take this, to a conclusion, we have we have who benefits from having them arguing over the current real estate?
Well, Professor Buchanan thought that they know where it is, They just want to keep a hold of it.
Right.
And they'll release it when they want to.
Right.
There's also a very interesting passage in one of the Jewish writings that Rabbi Akiba has said that there is the wastewater from the temple goes right past the entrance or underneath or in conjunction to King David's tomb. And King David's tomb, I believe, is just south of the southern wall of where we think the temple was. And it's still intact.
People have found it or
undiscovered?
Oh, it's still
No.
undiscovered. Well,
the traditional
or not
location
revealed.
is.
They may very well know where it is.
No, it's not.
Oh, really? Nobody knows where it is.
Yeah, it's not wheels.
Wow.
And there's Isaiah 22:22 talks about the house of David, and in a minority
Right.
of uses of the phrase house of David, it refers to the tombs. And there was a passage in Isaiah also that says, Isaiah 14, it talks about the tombs of the house, the tombs of the kings, each of them in their own house. Well, who would be the primary king? And that would be, King David. And there's traditions that say that Hezekiah was buried next to the tombs in the chiefest of the tombs of David. It's talking multiple tombs here.
Oh, interesting.
I've written an article on this called The Location and Future Discovery of King David's
Oh,
Tomb.
wow.
If it's not there, then it's going to be somewhere. And
nearby.
Even though there's no prophecies, there's no prophecy specifically, but there are hints that the tomb of David is still undiscovered. Josephus talks about King Herod knew where it was, knew where the tombs were, and he went in there at night, he not wanting to offend the Jews, and he punched a hole in one of the doors and broke in, and he took silver and furniture, Josephus says. And by the way, Josephus had the court records of King Herod given to him for his research by the Romans. That's how close he was to Vespasian and later Titus.
You can always count on King Herod to take advantage of an opportunity.
Well, then they went to the next door. Doors were probably wooden, I presume, or maybe, clayed up or something. Anyway, they would he specifically says, Josephus says, and I think it's in Antiquities of the Jews, that they punched a hole and they put a torch in there and a flame blew out and killed two of Herod's best friends.
Oh, my God.
And Herod ran out of there with a panic. And the next statement that Josephus says about King Herod after this incident, and he put a cenotaph right out in front, which is a structure, probably some type of pillar or something, not phallic in this case probably, but right at the entrance, and that went away somewhere. So the Romans knew where it was. I mean, after all, they had Josephus working for them.
Wow.
But that would have been, they got so much gold out of the temple that the price of gold dropped in half. The value of gold dropped in half, Josephus
Wow.
says. So they didn't have to go back and get King David's tomb, the gold from there.
Well, so
the bodies are still in
the
there.
bakers in the temple were goldsmiths.
Yeah. Now, if you read Acts chapter 2, Peter at Pentecost, he talks about King David, and he says that David is dead and buried, and his tomb is still with us. Now, it's almost like he's gesturing from the upper room, wherever that was. It may have been across the Tyropoeon Valley from the temple. And Peter was probably gesturing. And he said, but David is not ascended into heaven, but Jesus, whom you crucified, has been raised from the dead. Read Acts chapter
Yeah.
2. Peter says the tomb is still with us,
Right.
and it's unopened.
Right.
And that's and then Rabbi Akiba in after 117
Yeah.
AD, probably around 120 or 25, whenever Akiba was killed by the Romans, he says that goes through the water right next to David's tomb, and nobody has ever touched that tomb.
Wow.
This is all in my article.
Yeah. I'll have to check.
And nobody has ever touched the tomb of David.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out. So I just want to, is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
Oh, we've been going a while, haven't we?
Yeah, well, we certainly have to talk again. There's so much stuff to uncover and to bring to the surface.
This will all come out in God's time.
Yeah.
King David's tomb. Christ is not going to return in my lifetime. I think he won't return till the end of the century or even later. So I'm not setting any dates or anything.
Yeah. It's always a dangerous thing to do.
Always a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
And
God acts in his own time. God acts in his own time. The mind of God is not the mind of man.
A very strong expectation of Dr. Martin has written some articles on that. An expectation of Christ, of the Messiah coming, and he did, in the first century.
Mm.
And then, of course, the early church expected him to return soon until the mystery was revealed to Paul. And then they understood why things were not setting up. Up until about 61 to 62, 63, when the mystery was given to Paul that he talks about in Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians, and at the end, the last verses of Romans, he just mentions it briefly. This mystery made it clear to everybody that Christ was not returning in that generation, that it's talking about when you see all these things happen, that Jesus, now you could say it's a two-stage fulfillment. Back then, part of it was fulfilled, and later on, in future time to us, there has to be a temple. There are a lot of things that have to be done before Christ returns. Some of those, God might decide to change his mind, but most of those things will have to be done. Babylon has to be rebuilt at the original. Babylon is not New York City, and it's not, it's Babylon that's going to be rebuilt on the Euphrates River.
Wow.
I wrote an article called End Times, Not Yet.
Not yet.
Now, it does look like we're having a lot of wars and rumors of wars now, and there's earthquakes in diverse places, and we'll see more, and plagues.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you this also, back to Joseph Farrell. There are a lot of creatures out there. They're non-physical, but they can manifest physically, and there are maybe trillions of them. And this is why God's going to have, and Christ are going to have an army when they come back.
Yeah, well, I studied Buddhism for many years, and there was a Buddhist saint in the Himalayas, and she was instructing her students one day, and she said, "Sentient beings are as limitless as the sky."
Yeah.
Innumerable in number.
Well, God promised Abraham that his descendants would be as the sand of the sea.
Yeah, and I was talking to a friend of mine who's a flat out material atheist. I mean, not a bad person, but a flat out material atheist, and she was like, "I just don't see that anything happens after we die. I just don't see it." And I said, "Well." I said, think about consciousness, right? It's the most precious substance in the whole, it's the most precious thing in the whole universe, is to be aware of the universe, aware of itself, right? And, and just think about that. And everything else in the universe is recycled. But you're saying that consciousness is just discarded?
Yeah.
She said, that's a good point.
God's in the creation business.
Yeah.
He's not just in the salvation business.
Yeah.
We'll discuss that at another time.
Yeah.
Life is wonderful.